Oh, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Rewriting the North event. My name is David Cooper, and I teach in the Department of English at Manchester Metropolitan University. But I'm sort of talking to you now from the Portico Library, right in the centre of Manchester. And just outside the window, we've got trams, and soon I think we've got to have lots of football fans coming down because Man United are at home. So hence, this is why I've got the big headphones on to try and sort of block out the noise of the city. And so at Manchester Met, I'm the founding co-director of something called the Centre for Place Writing, which is a research group that is dedicated to exploring the complex and knotty relationship between writing and location. And we've got a particular interest in writing about the North, and then even more so, I guess, the Northwest of England. So, and over the past few years, it's been an enormous pleasure for me as sort of director of the Centre for Place Writing to work with the Portico Library on a series of events around the Portico Prize. And I'm sure many of you will know the Portico Prize is a major biennial award for new writing that, and I quote, best evokes the spirit of the North of England. And the 2020 Portico Prize was awarded back in January to Sally J. Morgan for her remarkable debut novel, Toto Among the Murderers, a book set in Leeds in the 1970s that sparked conversations about a range of intersecting issues, including coming out narratives, sexual violence against women, and the thin membrane between fact and fiction. And that last one, I think, is something we might be able to pick up on tonight. And as the library is always openly acknowledged, the sort of definition of the description of the Portico Prize is really open to interpretation. So what exactly is the spirit of the North of England? What is meant by that? So even more fundamentally, what is the North of England? Where does it begin and where does it end? Can the writer encapsulate this spirit whilst writing in locations and landscapes outside of the geographical territory, which again is maybe something that might come up tonight? And thanks to the generous support of Arts Council England, the Portico Library has organised Rewriting the North, which have been a series of events, of which this is the last of the current round. But as part of the Rewriting the North programme, the Portico Library has also put together a series of fascinating podcasts featuring practitioners working in a range of creative media and located in a range of very different landscapes. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to any of those podcasts, I really encourage you to do so as soon as you can. And we've organised events, author events, both here in the library in central Manchester, but also online to try and sort of reach new audiences who might find it difficult to get into central Manchester. And like I say, this evening's event is part of that Rewriting the North series and the last of the current round. And it's featuring two creative non-fiction writers, Tabitha Lasley and Jeff Young, both from the northwest of England. Well, I'll just introduce the two writers briefly. And Tabitha was a journalist for 10 years and has lived in London, Johannesburg and Aberdeen. Sea State, her first book, was published by HarperCollins in 2021 and was shortlisted for both the Gordon Byrne and Portico Prizes. Jeff is a Liverpool-based dramatist for theatre, radio and TV. He broadcasts essays for BBC Radio 3 and collaborates with musicians and artists on audio installations and performances. His memoir, Ghost Town, a Liverpool shadow play, was published in March 2020 by Little Toller and was shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award and was longlisted for the Portico Prize. And so what we're going to do tonight, I was going to ask Tabitha a few questions and then invite Tabitha to read for us. Then I was going to do the same with Jeff, and then ask Tabitha and Jeff, maybe we'll come together to sort of have a general chat about some of the issues that emerge out of both of these sort of brilliant works of creative non-fiction. Think of maybe some of the connections, but also some of the differences too. And as Debbie said, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and I'll try and keep an eye on them. And at the end, we'll have a bit of time to try and pick up on a few of those questions, if that's okay. So that's basically what we were going to sort of do as a sort of a format for the event. And so I say it'd be great if we could begin with Tabitha. And with Tabitha, there was I was reading sort of in like preparation for this event. Obviously read Sea State, which is a remarkable book, and I was reading a Guardian review by, I think it was Fiona Sturgis, about the book, which described it as part reportage and part memoir. And I just wanted to get things going. I just wondered what you made of that as a description of the book. Is that something that you identify with, you're happy with?
Yeah, very happy. It really was more accident than design, though. I got up there and, I don't know, I was just, I was really, 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 I originally meant the book to be sort of like a straight kind of reportage book about the oil industry. But, you know, I got up there and I started having this affair with this oil worker, and sort of the middle of my time there, I think sort of like around about the 3-month mark, I was like, oh God, like I haven't done enough interviews. And then I started like interviewing people quite frantically, but a lot of the men were really boring because, you know, people are not very good interviewees. Like as a rule, like most people cannot narrate their own lives in an interesting way, even if actually what's happened to them is objectively interesting. A good interviewee is vanishingly rare. I would say out of like the 100 interviews I did, maybe 10 were really good interviews and kind of made them into the book. And I found that when I was writing up my own experiences, it just came a lot easier. And I just thought to myself, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the book. But, you know, those 10 interviews were kind of good enough to be included. And I think sort of added an extra dimension. So I sort of just mashed the two things together. And every review of the book mentioned the kind of genre mashed nature of it in like a positive way. But actually, the agent I went to before I got my current agent, Tracy Bowen, told me that this sort of genre mash really wouldn't do at all. She was like, you can't have the two genres together. You can't have memoir and reportage. Like, you have to have either one or the other. And I'd really rather you had the reportage. And I said, but I haven't done, you know, anything like enough of great reportage. And also, like, the best writing in the book is the memoir element, you know, like that's, and it's 60% of the book. And she just said, kill your darlings. And so it just goes to show that I think for any sort of unpublished writers out there, you know, you tend to give a lot of weight to like an agent's opinion. You know, they're really the gatekeepers of this industry, and if you're unpublished, like you will pay particular attention to them. It really is just one person's opinion, and you know, if you feel sort of instinctively that you've got something that's worth sharing, I think you should carry on with it. That's the lesson of that.
And I think in my sort of day job, I often teach sort of contemporary creative nonfiction, and it's really, I think that sort of the mashup or sort of the blurring of sort of genres, I just think it's sort of incredibly exciting. And I think also, if we think about the Portico Prize, I think what's really good about the Portico Prize is that it's open to sort of writing of all sort of forms, really. And so it's books which are quite difficult to categorize. The Portico Prize is almost tailor-made for that. Can I just get just something you said about good interviewees are vanishingly rare? I was really interested in that. So what do you mean by that, sort of vanishingly rare?
Well, they just are. Like, I think most human qualities are product of environment, I think, rather than kind of like genetic inheritance. But actually, I do think being able to tell a story is possibly something you're born with. Because, you know, when I interviewed these men, like, you know, most of them were from similar sort of backgrounds, but some of them could tell a story and some of them really couldn't. Most of them couldn't. But there was a couple of them who were able to tell their stories in such an engaging way that I still think about them. I mean, not every day, but probably a couple of times a week. Like, there are certain men who I interviewed who I'll think, like, I wonder what he's doing now. I wonder if he kind of got that thing sorted out. That's the power of storytelling. That's the power of being a good interviewee. That, you know, you can tell your story and somebody's mind will snag on it and they'll be thinking about it 7 years later.
Really interesting to say that, because I was thinking about like power of storytelling and what you say, people's ability to narrate their own lives. One of the sort of abiding memories of reading the book is the amount of time that the men spend on their phones. And I just wanted, and that's really sort of stayed with me, and so just that constant scrolling. And I was just wondering about that, the connection between that and the ability or the lack of ability to narrate.
I mean, I think it's very possible. I think the way that we use our phones has broken our brains irreparably. Like, I often think about my A-levels and the fact that, you know, during my A-levels, I was able to sit there on Sundays and do 2-3 hour exams in a day. Like, I could never do that now. Like, I'd walk out in the middle of it. Like, I could never concentrate for that long. But I think the more kind of obvious thing with the men and their phones was their dependence on women, which I found really interesting. It's like many work offshore see themselves as these really kind of buccaneering, like almost like modern day pirates. You know, they're independent, they go off like 3 weeks out of 6, they don't need anyone. But in fact, like the phone, like it creates a conduit to home, or not necessarily home, but to women back on shore. And they are among the most dependent men on women's opinions I've ever met. The gulf between how they see themselves and how they actually are is so vast. And I think that that phones have a lot to answer for. You know, once upon a time when you only got like, you know, a sort of quick phone call at a booth with a queue of 10 people behind you, you kind of had to be independent. You had to cut off from home. But like now they can't and they don't. And I have never met a class of men who are so dependent on being witnessed by women. You know, women aren't physically there, but they're there kind of in the ether. And I think because, you know, offshore it's quite Spartan, the sort of, you know, the day-to-day kind of existence is quite austere. It makes them kind of more dependent on women, not less. And the phone has really facilitated that.
Yeah, and I think that's again really interesting. And so, is there a generational sort of difference then? Because there's like there seems to be like different generations of sort of all. So there's many went up there like in the 1980s, and then there's obviously a much younger generation.
There is a generational difference, but I would say that like older people still use phones. They might not use them, you know, with the same facility or the same enthusiasm as the younger generation, but they still use them. And I think now they've got a means to express that dependence, whereas once upon a time, maybe they just had to keep it in.
Yeah. And I think that sort of the idea sort of dependence is fascinating. And I was really struck at the end of the book, obviously most of it is in Aberdeen, and then towards the end of the book you come back to the northwest, and there's a line in it, and I've written it down, which I was really struck by, where it says you suggest that something is always lost when human freedom is curtailed. So, and it just seems to me that there's a lot in the book about like freedom and then like dependency and maybe risk. Just wondered whether you could just say a bit more of what extent you think the book is about, like freedom and risk, maybe.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think the book is very much about freedom, the freedom to exercise your own choices. But what I would say is freedom is always very dearly bought. You know, like you know, when you free yourself, you invariably make things harder for somebody else. It might not be that you're making them harder for yourself, but when a man walks out of his marriage, when he's got, say, you know, a big mortgage and 2 children, he might make things easier for himself, but he's definitely making things harder for the people he leaves behind. One of the themes of the book was the parallels I drew between myself as the narrator and the men. You know, like I really related to them. You know, we were both like part of a dying industry. We were both watching our industry that we'd worked in for 20 years sort of, you know, dying before our eyes. And, you know, personal freedom has always been very important to me. And I think it's quite, of the idea of personal freedom is quite important to the men who work offshore. You know, you would think that an industry like that would be quite heavily unionized, heavily regulated. In fact, it's not at all. You know, union activity has only been legitimate out there since 2000. So no time at all, really. And, you know, a lot of them have got this kind of very, I suppose, buccaneering attitude, which has got more in common with Thatcherism than anything else. And I suppose, I mean, I'm left-wing in some ways, but I am a big believer in personal freedom. But when I wrote that line, really, I was more thinking of teenagers, because if you remember, I was in the car with a teenager. I was taking him home. And I was thinking about the fact that, to go back to phones, teenagers these days grow up with no concept of privacy. They're being filmed all the time. They're never truly free because they're on camera all the time. You know, if they're not being filmed by CCTV, which is everywhere now, they're being filmed, you know, by their friends, or they're filming themselves. You know, when we used to go out, the conversation was actually about going out and going to clubs. You know, when we used to go out in the 90s, we were completely free. There were no phones. You know, we could go out and take drugs and just, you know, get really messy, like in a very literal sense. They can't do that now. And I do feel for them. I do think that actually, you know, teenagers these days, they don't grow up with any freedoms at all, really.
I think it's yeah, on that sort of slightly depressing note about freedom, I just want, could I ask you to sort of read a bit from Sea State? Would that be okay?
I'm going to read a bit from the chapter you mentioned, which is the very last chapter, when I'm actually in a refinery town, Ellesmere Port. My money all gone, I found a job in a takeaway. By coincidence, it was in this last man's hometown. The town was made up of 4 big council estates connected by a rundown high street. It felt like a backwater, a place cut off from mainland ways. It was like an overseas enclave of Spain where no one ate their tea before 9 at night. Several of our regulars worked offshore. They were contractors oscillating between the rigs and the refinery, and they brought scraps of news back with them. After the crisis, the price of Brent crude picked up again, and companies began recruiting. Only this time, workers were being contracted to dismantle the platforms, plug the wells, and ship the parts off piecemeal. The North Sea was shutting up shop. I thought there must be something uniquely depressing about this work, asset stripping in the literal sense. Nothing to show for their efforts but absence, a square mile of sea returned to its natural state. Furthermore, these structures were the same that had kept their families housed, clothed, and fed for years, and this work would be a continual reminder that their way of life was dying. If they had been cautious or pessimistic or both, they might have saved enough money to stay afloat while they worked out what to do next. But there would always be others who followed our government's improvident example and imagined their luck would last forever. I took an outsider's interest in the town, its grievances and blood feuds, its large interconnected families and many layered loyalties. Unemployment was high, a lot of people sold drugs for a living. Jail was a market risk, but it didn't necessarily affect the bottom line. If a person went to jail, his graft was passed on to his brothers, though as with any family business, it retained the founding partner's name. Customers lived in a permanent state of debt, strapping drugs from one outfit, then moving on to the next until they exhausted all their options and had to pay back the first. Round and round they went, always owing 9 out of 10. The results of this shonky system of credit and remittance were everywhere. Often young men, alumni of the same school of hard knocks my first boyfriend attended, came into the shop with black eyes, split lips and bruised knuckles. I learned it was part of the town's protocol not to ask questions, to pretend it was normal to walk around looking like this. Occasionally, I was called upon to break a fight at the front of the shop, and once to order a boy to drop his girlfriend when I saw him trying to bundle her into the back of a car, as you might order a dog to drop a bone. I put the grill down and led her and her friend out through the kitchen. "He won't change, you know," I said as I unbolted the back door. "I keep telling her that," her friend said, "but fuck will she listen." Since my old job was a kind of licensed nosiness, it was perhaps unsurprising that the only part of my new job I really enjoyed was standing around gossiping with locals. All this stopped when our driver was sacked and I was demoted to deliveries. He kept disappearing halfway through his shift with the money. He'd reappear the next day, always with a plausible excuse and the right amount in the wrong denominations. Gambling, the owner thought, or payday loans, or both. The problems were comorbid. So like Annette Cosway, riding her horse in a tattered ball gown, I put on my old London clothes, my horse-leg boots, my leather leggings, my one good coat, to trudge up and down paths, delivering orders and accepting tips until they were worn out, full of holes and fit for nothing. I got to know the area quite well, better than many of the residents, whose loyalties tend to be tied to their estates. The town was going through a period of expansion, and there was a lot of development on the outskirts. Once, I was sent to a new address behind a motorway junction. My phone made several attempts to find it, then gave up. As I drove up and down blind alleys past empty warehouses and lumber yards, I became convinced the call was a trick, that I was about to be raped and thrown in the canal. Then suddenly, I rounded a corner and was on a gleaming tarmac close lined with tall, narrow houses. The houses didn't look like British houses, but were built in the Huguenot style, with gabled windows and Juliet balconies. Something about their spindly Cinderella proportions and the plot's unlikely placement made the whole encounter feel unreal. By the time I got back to the shop, I was starting to doubt I'd seen it at all. I tried to imagine living there, allowing my child to walk home through a deserted trading estate, or even attempting the walk myself, and could not. There is usually a rationale to the way a town develops, a reason why people occupy one part and industry another, but these new estates defied all logic. They were just dumped on spits of brownfield and requisition march, areas with no amenities and few safe approaches. There were estates that overlooked the plants, estates that abutted the motorway, estates lapped by the foamy brown waters of the river, estates where the air seemed to fizz or sound on the edge of sensation of prickle in the atmosphere, because the lots backed onto the substation or were hemmed in by rows of pylons. There were large flashing signs on the high streets that monitored the levels of air pollution. Bad, the sign said some days, and on other days, very bad. Day and night, the refinery burned off noxious substances, which hung over town in a sulphurous cloud, adding a sickly yellow tincture to the sunset. At times, the shop smelt of rotten eggs, which I assumed was the drains, until the owner put me right. I came to understand that the town's casual attitude to violence, what was a beating, a knife fight, as compared to this ceaseless environmental assault, the cost of chemical living. When I worked in magazines, proximity to other people's money gave me an unearned sheen. Now the same process was happening in reverse. Increasingly, I resembled our customers. My skin lost tone, my hair began to break off and fall out. Photos from that time show me looking like a medieval pinup, pale and drawn, my forehead half an inch higher than it used to be. A new boy replaced me on the counter. He was large and ungainly, with shrewd little eyes like bits of blue glass. He had a habit of standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. He could make a mess of any task. The physical world was mobilized against him. Once, he tried to put the vacuum cleaner away and got wrapped up in the wires like Laocoon. The flex and the hose got snarled around him and then around each other. And he spent a full 10 minutes turning this way and that, trying to fight his way out. People thought he was stupid, but he was actually clever. It was part of his cleverness to pretend to be stupid, to act the buffoon, so he could get away with doing nothing. I realised this when he told me he was taking A-levels at college and was predicted 2 A's and a B. That's what I got, I said. You never know. If you get your head down and really apply yourself, in 20 years' time, you could be working in a chicken shop.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. Yeah, that was brilliant, so thank you. That's okay. Thanks very much. So if we could turn to you now, Jeff. And so obviously there was sort of ghost towns, sort of, long listed for Portico. And I just wondered, sort of what made you write this book, this memoir, if I don't know, if it is indeed a memoir, what made you sort of write it at this particular moment in your life?
Yeah, well, the book began as a series of radio essays. I had no intention of it becoming a book. You know, I wrote 5 15-minute essays for Radio 3 that were memoir-esque, you know, but they were mainly talking about the significance of particular places and particular people and particular works of art and books. When it kind of transformed into being a book, it became this kind of like mixture of the past and the present, and it became this multi-layered. That phrase that Tabitha used about mashup, you know, the mash, it became this like filleting and layering together at different time zones and periods in my life. And I think what I wanted to do with the book was really to explore that, how memory works and how memory, how I see memory kind of filtered through particular places, and the haunted nature of those places where memories keep churning and rising to the surface and being glimpsed in the shadows. So I think that's what I was trying to do. You know,
I think that's sort of, as a reader, that's a real defining characteristic of the book. That's sort of the collapsing of like sort of time, really, and also the breaking down of the past and the present. We're sort of constantly moving between them. Can I just pick up on the word haunting, because I suppose it's sort of flagged up in the title. I'm also sort of like really curious about the subtitle, the Liverpool Shadow Play. So I just wondered whether you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think that's what memory is. You know, memory is a haunting, and I've always been a great kind of wanderer of cities, particularly Liverpool, and wherever I walk through the streets of Liverpool and into whichever buildings I'm walking into and past, they're haunted. You know, they speak. In those shadows, there are ghosts, and I don't mean that in a supernatural way particularly, because I don't necessarily believe in ghosts in that sense. But I think that I think that that's what ghosts are, and I think that that's what happens in particular places. You know, I can see dead people. You know, I can see my ancestors. I can see my mum and my sister, and people from generations ago that also walk those streets. You know, my grandparents, and so it's a shadow play in that this kind of puppet show almost. You know, it's like a theatre. The city itself is a theatre where the shadows are the ghosts, and the ghosts are the memories, and so on. You know, and that's where that kind of cutting together and folding together of time takes place within the shadow play.
It's really interesting that sort of like the city is theatre and sort of ideas of performance. I just wondered, when you were writing the book, did you have any ambition to rewrite Liverpool as a city, to sort of do away with some like the sort of cliches and stereotypes about the city, or didn't you really have that in mind?
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah, I don't have much time for the cliches and the stereotypes. You know, I wanted to paint a different picture, to show a different face or different faces of the city. You know, the kind of possibilities of the city that were there, that were kind of more, you know, kind of more metaphysical, kind of not so concrete. The city as a place of imagination and as an imagined space, you know, and a lot of the places in the book, a lot of the architecture and the derelict cinemas and so on, that I write about in the book are feats of the imagination, you know. And I think I was trying to say, we've stopped the people who kind of own the city, who build the city, the powers that be, have lost their imaginations, and the city needs to be reimagined and revivified and kind of. I think there's somewhere in the book where I say something to the effect of the city. You know, the city kind of has autoimmune disease, and it needs it needs its health reviving, and I think that comes through the imagination. The kind of moments in the book where I touch on quite angrily sometimes, where I touch on the kind of failings of the political failings within the city, city council and so on. I think what I'm trying to do is cast a spell, you know, and say there is more to the spreadsheet. You know, there is more to the there's a hell of a lot more to the city than the corruption and the kind of inanity of the new developments and so on. You know, I wanted to do that. I wanted to cast a spell.
I just have a question when you were saying that about sort of like the sort of politics of the city. I was just wondering. I wonder how us Liverpool hosting Eurovision. I wonder what effect that's going to have on sort of the city. But I won't go there. Also, sort of. I might just. But when you were talking, what I was thinking was also, it reminds me, there's because I'm speaking from the centre of Manchester here, there's a great book of poems, Mancunia, by Michael Simmons Roberts, which was published a few years ago, where like and he talks about like Manchester, he wants to be Manchester, like part real, part dream, part like Hardy talks about that in terms of Essex, that sort of like place being both material and a place of like fantasy and dreaming, really. I just wonder whether it's this sorry. Sorry, Jeff, yeah.
No, I'm just saying the word dreaming. I thought, well, I'm going to say the word dreaming.
I wonder, could I ask you just to read a bit from Ghost Town? If that's okay?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to read a bit from. I was thinking of the stuff that Tabitha was just that reading there when she was talking about the estates, you know. So I thought I'd just read a bit about when we first moved to Mughal. Well, I never name it in the book, but when we moved to the estates, you know, and it's about, I suppose I was about 8-9 years of age at this particular point in the reading, and it's from a chapter called The Truant Zone, where I kind of got a bit feral, I suppose, and saw that kind of feral roaming nature as well, in retrospect, I kind of see that as what I wanted to become. You know, I wanted to become that kind of feral roamer. You know, so I'll read you this. I look into my memory and watch the boy I used to be. He is walking across the rough field on his way to school, where he will be bullied for losing David Edwards' fountain pen. He knows where certain birds are, and he likes the bit where the path becomes sandy like a beach. Sometimes he meets Ramshaw here, a boy who doesn't want to go to school. They share their sweets and say nothing much at all. But most of the time he is all alone, the boy. He doesn't want to be lonely, but he wants to be alone. Across a broken wall, there is a ruined garden with a pear tree. He believes he is the only boy who knows about this tree. And every day he picks a pear and eats it on the way to school. It tastes delicious, like vanilla and lemon. When he gets to school, he will be beaten up in the cloakrooms. Through a backyard gate, I see a boy wearing flying goggles and sitting in a dustbin. He is sitting at the controls of a Lancaster bomber, issuing instructions to his ground crew, who scurry about attending to final details. When the boys see me, they take me prisoner and threaten to execute me as an enemy spy. They argue about who will kill me. And one of the boys says he killed the last spy they captured and doesn't want any more blood on his hands. The aeroplane is built out of dustbins, an old mangle and clothes maidens. The joystick is a yard brush. One of the boys, his name is Murray, sees something in me worth saving. And before I know it, I'm invited on the flight. We have to lick a battery to give the plane power. We pass the battery from hand to hand, from tongue to tongue, and then we taxi down the runway. The junkyard bomber is heavy in the air. We do not ride the wind, we break the air apart. Roger, 10-4, over and out. I have made some friends and we are flying to the stars. Me and a boy called Bernard are on an adventure, lighting swan vestas to help us see in the dark. We kneel down in the cold earth inside the canal-side military pillbox. The sun shoots in through the gun slits. There is always pornography in pillboxes. Who are the men who come here in the dark? What if they turn up and discover us looking through their magazines? We leaf through them, obsessing over vital statistics. 36, 24, 36, 38, 24, 36. We read them out loud. It's exciting. We pay more attention to the numbers than the pictures of the women. We go out into the sunlight and walk down the towpath, and I'm thinking, if they decide to start the war again, we are ready for them, because the pillboxes and tank traps are still in place. And the war is in the living room. Vietnam bleeding from the television and invading the evening meal until mum switches it off. And the family return to supper in the suburbs of Liverpool. I think of jungles on fire, terrifyingly beautiful reds and yellows, children running and burning. I'm fascinated by this war, but I don't know what it is. No one ever talks about it. The tanks roll into Prague. On the gates of the canal lock, a stone's throw from the tobacco factory, A storm-battered cormorant hangs its wings out to dry. I walk towards it slowly and crouch down on the gravel path. The bird suddenly drops into the loch water like a drunk in a wet overcoat. I creep towards the edge of the loch and peer down into the dark water. No sign of the bird at first, but then it rises up to the surface, churning the murk, thrashing amongst pop cans and takeaway cartons, almost pulling the water up with its body, a desperate panic. For a few seconds, it hurtles up and down the loch from gate to gate, and then it opens up a space in the water and disappears inside it, thrashing and churning and making an abysmal mess of garbage and dirt. When it comes up to the surface again, there is something else entangled in the flotsam, the dead body of the second cormorant, broken-winged and floating face down in the chaos. The diver forces itself out of the loch, up onto the gate, and hangs there, looking down into the water where the dead bird floats for a moment or two until the churning settles and it sinks beneath the surface. And then the whole tormented ballet starts again. And it occurs to me that the diving bird is trying to save the dead bird's life or pull it out of its death and into the world of living. I watch this terrible ritual for 10, 20 minutes, feeling helpless, bewilderingly awestruck and emotional. I can't take it anymore and walk away, but glance back once to see the crow of the sea preparing to plunge once more into the plastic bottle flotsam, into the burial water. Again and again, the tanks roll into Prague, and Bernard and I get the wars confused. When the news is on television, I only half watch it. Every time my mother sees me looking at the Vietnam War, she turns the TV off. So it's hard to know why the American boys in helmets are shooting people in rice fields and setting forests and children on fire in a place that's full of helicopters, phosphorus bombs, and water buffalo. And somewhere around this time, there are Soviet tanks on the streets of Prague, and Jan Palach sets himself alight in Wenceslas Square. Bernard and I are excited, but we're frightened too. We recite the names of guns, Ithaca 37, Remington, Winchester, and we say things like fragmentation grenade, rocket launcher, as we crawl through the hedgerows and ditches of the fields on the edge of the city. The war is a waking dream where Soviet tanks are rolling into Liverpool like floats on student rag week. And in the living room, Bobby Kennedy is shot with a .22 caliber revolver, and then he's lying dead, rosary beads in his hand. My parents are whispering, and suddenly Ina Sharples is in the living room instead of death. When I go to sleep, Vietnam and Prague and Kennedy are in my dreams. My mother wakes me and my sister Val and opens the curtains. Over the rooftops, around the chimney, there's a shadow play of owls.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. And so I wonder whether I could ask sort of Tabitha to come back in, because I thought it'd be sort of good just to sort of have time just for sort of a bit of a chat, really. And so if anyone's got any questions, if they want to put it in the chat and the text, I'll keep half an eye on that and see and sort of pose the questions to Jeff and to Tabitha. And I just wondered, like sort of thinking about this event, I was thinking about the two books, and obviously we were thinking about place and when we sort of set up this event, and they two books have very different relationships with place. Obviously Tabitha's goes up to Aberdeen, sort of a new city, whereas Jeff's writing about the city that he knows so well. So I think there's things to think about there. But I wanted to begin with, can we just go back actually to we were talking about like sort of mash up between sort of like different forms, and I just wondered like to what extent do you think you both draw upon sort of the sort of devices of the fiction writer when writing creative non-fiction? Do you? So I wanted Tabitha, whether that's something that you have in mind.
I mean, I think I probably did, but not consciously. The way I taught myself to write was just to read a lot of work by writers I admired, and most of that was fiction. some of it was non-fiction, but most of it was fiction. So if the book has a kind of novelistic feel, it's probably just because of that, really, because I taught myself to do it by reading novels. So even though, you know, the content of the book is non-fiction, you know, I guess the style is kind of fictive. But it's not something I did consciously. I'm not sure if you can do it consciously, to be honest with you. I honestly think thinking about like the technique of writing too much is like talking about the technique of walking too much. You know, you'll start tripping over your own feet. I think it mostly has to be done by instinct.
And it's interesting you're saying about like the reading, like reading a lot of fiction writers. And I just wondered, this is something that come up in a conversation I've had with Jeff actually as well, about sort of like the way that sort of both books immerse the reader, and sort of like maybe sort of in the fictional sense, because I think Sea State as a reader, it's like a real page turner, and so you do become like immersed, I think, in that narrative. And I do think it has that novelistic feel. Just wondered, Jeff, what do you think about sort of that relationship between sort of non-fiction and fiction writing?
Yeah, I think again, it's as Tabitha says there, it's not at the forefront of my mind. So it is kind of unconscious, but you're kind of making decisions about what to remove, you know, what stays in place. And I think just the very act of removing particular events or people from the narrative is kind of a shaping of the story, you know. But I also think that the way I've tried to play with the layering of time in the book is kind of related to the writing of fiction too. Like in that section that I just read, you playing with lots of different, you know, places and layer of time, and bringing the, you know, it's coming in through the TV screen, but you bring in the Vietnam War and Prague into it, and the section in that about the cormorant in the canal locks is from a different time in my life, you know. So I'm talking about being an 8 and 9-year-old, but the cormorant story, I was probably in my late 20s or 30s, you know. Same kind of place, same territory, the canal. But it's like, as I'm going on that journey down the canal, because I kind of write, I write as I walk, you know, or I walk as I write or whatever. As I'm going down there, I'm remembering, oh my God, this is where the cormorant happened, you know, the cormorant death, and that folds into the story, you know. So I'm going. So I think there are things in common with fiction, because you're selecting your material and shaping it into, you know, the kind of whatever structure works, you know.
I think that idea sort of like removing stuff, and like and apologies if this is a real sort of reader's question rather than a writer's question, but to what extent were you sort of thinking about the reader, or did you have like particular readers in mind, or were you worried about readers when you were writing your books? So in order to Tabitha, have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely because of like the material in my book and the fact that it deals with other people and deals with sort of their lives as well as my own. I did really worry about it, and initially it really kind of it really held up my progress. You know, I could really only make headway with the book when I decided to forget about all that and to forget about this notional reader, because initially when I started writing it, like I could literally feel somebody on my shoulder being like, ooh, don't put that, ooh, or that, you know, and that is really, it is going to impede you. So eventually I just had to forget about that, and I had to forget about how I would come across to people. And, you know, I think that obviously there are going to be people out there who hate the book and who hate the me in the book. Like that's just, you know, it's just part of putting any work out there. I think into the public domain, there are going to be people who don't like it and don't like you, or don't like the representation of you within the piece of work. But you know, fortunately, nobody who hates it has ever got in touch.
Just out of curiosity, was the book reviewed locally in Aberdeen at all, like in a local newspaper? Or?
There was a really long, nice piece about it, but I'm not sure if he's from Aberdeen. Like, he worked on an Aberdeen newspaper, but I don't know if he was actually Aberdonian. So I suspect not. I think maybe he'd just gone there for the job.
Right.
And I didn't really look for reviews. Like Patrick, our PR at Fourth Estate, sent me the good ones and kind of just hid the bad ones. And I'm really happy for us to kind of, observe that kind of protocol, because I don't want to see the bad. I think the mail is a stinker, but I didn't look. So more like a hide under the duvet kind of person, like if something bad's going on, I don't want to know about it. So yeah.
I think that's a reasonable position to adopt. So Jeff, what about you with them readers? Did you sort of like think about how have particular readers in mind, or were you worried about readership?
You know what though, I wrote the book with the readers in mind were two people who'd never be able to read it because they died, and they're two people who feature strongly in the book, and that's my mum and my sister Val. Val died while I was writing the book, and we'd sometimes have conversations when I was sitting with her as she was dying about, this is what's happening in the book, where I was telling her where I was up to. And she would say, I can't wait to read it, and she never got to read it because she died before it was published. And so my readers who I'm voicing it to are two people who are no longer here, my mum and my sister, And I don't think I really thought beyond that. I just thought I've got to find a way to get all this down on paper. And if those two people were here, I'd love to know what they thought of it, So, yeah.
Did I say on Twitter today? Was it your mum's birthday today?
Today she'd have been 92 today. Yeah, yeah. She died 20 years ago though. So, but yeah, yeah.
I was going to say, if people are on Twitter and aren't following Jeff, do follow Jeff straight away. And some like lovely photos were posted on there before. I spotted there's a few questions in the chat, so if I just sort of read them out, if that's okay. And there's a question from Saul, and this is testimony after I spent a whole day of teaching before this. But one of the greatest words which I discovered in Jeff's book is petrosoma. Do you know what that word is, Jeff? Petrosoma tigli.
Oh,
is
God, no.
If we'd done this 8 hours ago, I probably would have pronounced that much better than I have there. But the question is there a Steve States equivalent of this idea of, and it's quote, symbols or signs that unleash the mythic and folkloric potential of a place, the buried and forgotten songs, stories, dances of a place that can be brought up to the surface? So the questions for Tabitha really, was there something in sort of sea state of like sort of something about place, about sort of the mythic potential of Aberdeen?
I don't think Aberdeen has any mythic potential. The most boring place. It's almost like the anti-Liverpool. Like, I think Liverpool's kind of like urban correlative is Glasgow. It's like a big Irish population on the west coast of the country. There's a lot of rain. People there love to drink, they love to take drugs, they love to spend their money going out. Like, people from Liverpool and Glasgow always seem to get on really well. Yeah. Aberdeen is it's really different. It's a really dry city in both senses of the word. It doesn't rain that much because it's on the east coast of the country. And it's dry in terms of like the people there are very austere. Like, I mean, I taught on a course quite recently, like in August, and there was a girl there from Aberdeen who was like a stand-up comic, and she always said like the worst crowds she had were in her hometown, which is, that's quite unusual for like a homegrown comic. But she just said, people in Aberdeen, like, they don't laugh. So yeah, I would say no. Like, Aberdeen is a place where you go to like make money or farm beef. like one or the other. But yeah, I didn't find any mythic potential in the city. Really, all I wanted to do with the book is nail down a particular time and place. I wanted to nail down what it was like to be in Aberdeen or kind of any sort of provincial northern city in 2015. But things like the mythic potential, I don't think I was thinking that big, to be honest with you. My ambitions were more modest than that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I was going to say before, actually, I went to Aberdeen for the first time for work recently, and this is where the book is so interesting about place, because whilst I was there, I felt like I was going with your book in mind, really, and I was trying to work out the geography of the book. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in that relationship with places once I've read the place before I actually visited the material place. But as a reader, yeah, I don't think that mythical sense of Aberdeen doesn't sort of come across in the book. This is a question for Jeff. Sorry, Tabitha.
I was just saying it's really not a very interesting place. Like, some places are interesting and some places aren't, and it's not an interesting place.
This is a question for Jeff. You said that, quote, this is from Marcel. A question for Jeff. You said that memories are haunting, which I'm definitely going to quote, he says. And I wonder how you feel about the stone tape theory, the concept that the surroundings buildings where something horrible or traumatic happens imprint with that trauma. Or is that just another take on the human awareness of memory and tragedy related to a specific place, without the place itself having anything to do with it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
There.
Yeah, I think that quite simply, Marcel, I'm well into that. It's like I've been doing quite a bit of writing at the moment for my next book about about stone, really, about how particular. There's sections in the book. The book is not just Liverpool based in the new book, but there are sections of the book in Liverpool, and it's about how particular materials that the buildings are made of, particular types of stone. Like Portland stone features quite a lot in Liverpool architecture. The Forum Cinema is made from Portland stone. I just became completely fascinated by the fact that you got this magnificent building in the city centre, which is now semi-derelict, but how it's from another place. It's from a place down on the south coast of Britain, but it's been transported here. So I kind of think it's brought some of that with it, and now it's sitting there. It's quite a sad and forlorn building now, But I've always, for years, gone around cities, I suppose Liverpool particularly, and I touch the stone, I touch the materials that they're made of, and see kind of see what I can absorb from it, how they resonate or vibrate. I think the stone tapes thing is, I think that's a beautiful concept, and I think it does relate to the shadow play that I'm trying to write about. It's like places resonate with stories, and so do the stones. Yeah, it's a poetics of place. Yeah.
It's fascinating that you're writing about stone, Jeff, because obviously stone does feature in Ghost Town, but again, as this is just me as a reader, it's also just a place which is just so fluid. In the city is so sort of fluid in Ghost Town. It's just so watery, and so there's a lot of sort of rain at times. So well, so it's interesting. The next book is very.
I mean, Liverpool's primarily a sandstone city, and I find that beautiful. That sandstone, sandstone eventually turns to sand, returns to sand, returns to dust. I find it, it kind of insults the city when the wrong materials are used in it. It becomes it transforms the kind of temperament or the mood of the city. But I do find it fascinating that the biggest cathedral in the city, the Anglican Cathedral, is basically an enormous sandcastle. It won't last forever because the rain will take it away, and I just think that's gorgeous.
That's a brilliant image. Can I just ask you a question about, and it goes back to the Portico Prize, for which you both sort of listed, and I just wondered whether you identify as northern writers, and particularly that sort of, because the whole prize is around like this capturing the spirit of the north, and I just wondered to what extent you do, or maybe you don't, identify as northern writers. So I wondered, Tabitha, whether you could respond to that.
Yeah, I definitely do. Like, I've only written one book, and the book is about myself, a northern person. So I would say, by that logic, I'm a northern writer. Yeah, I think that like the Northwest particularly, I think it's a feeling. You take it everywhere you go. I've lived in lots of different cities. Like, I spent most of my 20s in London, and then I moved to Johannesburg for a while, and then back to London. I really wasn't up north for most of my 20s, but I always felt northern. I really do think it is it's a spirit that you bring with you, and it's almost like a lens that like you see everything through. Yeah, I think even if I were to live out of the country for like a decade, I'd still be northern writer.
I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, sort of the lens which you see things through, because there was much debate around the Portico Prize really about like what constitutes sort of northern writing, and like people responded like some of the books that were maybe listed they felt weren't sort of northern, but everyone I've asked that question have said, well, they do maybe like you say, it's about sort of spirit. Jeff, what do you think about like particularly that tag northern really?
Yeah, I completely agree with Tabitha. I am northern. My sensibility and temperament are northern. I'm a northerner who faces west. My house faces the sunset. I'm a northwesterner. And yet again, like Tabitha, I've lived in different places. I lived in Amsterdam. I lived, traveled a lot. Lived in Germany. Lived in Barcelona. Lived in Cornwall. But I've always, even when I was living in those different places, I saw myself as a northerner from this city, and I've always returned. And probably 70-80% of the work I've done, the writing over the years, has been about the city and the people in it. I've written about other places. I've written about Brazil and Amsterdam and Mexico even, but majority of my stuff is urban and northern, and particularly this city, Liverpool. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I think that's sort of a great note on which to end both this event and the sort of this current round of Rewriting the North events. So thank you all very much for sort of attending the event. I apologise to Saul for not pronouncing that word correctly, so I apologize for that. Thank you all for sort of logging in this evening. And I just wanted to end by thanking both Jeff and Tabitha. Thank you very much for sort of taking part this evening for the amazing readings as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Cheers.
Okay, and for everyone else, watch out for future announcements about events around the Portico Prize. So the next prize won't be sort of too far around the corner. So yeah, watch your space. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.